My dearest brothers and sisters, this is Hakann speaking. I greet you in peace and love. What often happens on earth is that a spiritual person learns a high perspective, such as, all is one and the service to self path, or in other words being evil is valid and ultimately everyone will be alright and rise above division. It's great to learn of those higher perspectives. Yet, a problem sometimes occurs when a spiritual person then uses that high perspective to invalidate lower perspectives, in themselves or in others. Or the spiritual person pretends that they have fully embraced this high perspective, when that's not actually their authentic truth. Instead of using higher perspectives to invalidate lower perspectives, what is actually wiser is being able to see from both higher and lower perspectives, and know when to look from which perspective, and not to discard either perspective. So for example, a person might say it's all just experiences, and all experiences are ultimately equally valuable. But, 1. It's good to have the wisdom not to say that to someone who is acutely suffering. And 2. Note that those people who say that are still locking their front door and are still avoiding dark alleyways at night. If a person's one and only perspective is that everything is all just an equally valid experience, then why do they lock your front door? By their own logic, having someone break into their house is simply just another valid experience. But of course, people do lock their front doors. Here we see that people are able to look at things from both the higher everything is a valid experience perspective, and a lower I should lock my front door perspective. And that's great. It's very functional to be able to look at things from multiple perspectives, and being wise enough to know when to use which perspectives. And this also illustrates that people shouldn't use higher perspectives to invalidate lower perspectives, in themselves or in others. As another example, ultimately no matter who becomes President of the United States, you will be free. On the other hand, who becomes President does matter, and it probably will affect your life. I personally think it would be better if the person pretending to be Trump became President. Both this higher and this lower perspective are true, and it's useful to be able to see both. An example of using a higher perspective to invalidate a lower perspective is that some spiritual teachers right now are saying that real spiritual people don't have a preference for who becomes president, because they claim that is the only true way to rise above division. But then if you listen to these people talk for an extended period of time, sooner or later they'll usually reveal that they actually do have a preference. They're just not being authentic about it. And not being authentic will only create a split inside yourself. In some cases, spiritual people try to invalidate lower perspectives because they're in resistance to lower perspectives or they're in resistance to engaging with messy, worldly matters. Yes, earth politics is messy and ugly, and I wouldn't recommend the average person to spend too much time engaging in politics, and I wouldn't recommend demonizing the other side. But you chose to be born in a messy and ugly world, and being in resistance to the world you're in isn't very spiritual. So, there's nothing wrong with having a political preference. As another example, this channeler hasn't forgiven a certain family member of his for mistreating him when he was a child. If you meet the channeler and ask him, he'll straight up tell you that. This is despite the channeler understanding that a more evolved version of himself would forgive that family member. Yet, today the channeler's authentic truth is that he hasn't yet forgiven that person, and if he forced himself to forgive that person today then he would only be bulldozing parts of himself. It wouldn't benefit the channeler to force himself to forgive that person. Likely there will come a time when the channeler will forgive that family member of his. However, that will only be once all parts of the channeler are on board with forgiving that person. Finally, in previous channelings, Ashta and Tourmaline have shared that the service to self path, or the evil path, is valid. And from a high perspective, it is. Yet simultaneously the lower perspective is also true that the choice to help others is better in certain ways than the choice to harm others for personal gain. Both choices are valid, however choosing the path of unity consciousness will ultimately make both yourself and the people around you happier than choosing the path of separation consciousness. Ashta and Tourmaline see and understand both perspectives. So on one hand, they are reminding people that the choice to be evil is valid, and this is useful to know because it doesn't ultimately benefit you to hate evil people. On the other hand, Ashta and Tourmaline are also working to protect the innocent. They are sharing teachings through which people can reduce their suffering, and they are working towards the liberation of Earth. So, I would advise you not to use higher perspectives to invalidate lower perspectives. Instead, I invite you to see both higher and lower perspectives, and to see that both have value, and to use either perspective as appropriate. Your star brother, Hakann.